And by the way, what you saw in that graph affected little towns too. It affected the whole country. It's just that, as always in criminology, urban environments are going to show higher concentrations of crime for reasons related to proximity and population, right? So, I mean, the truth is Philadelphia is a triumph in terms of improvement of public safety this year and last year, which was the year when the country, the whole country, had its biggest improvement in public safety in recorded criminological history.
Back on the Young Turks. Now joining me, Larry Krasner. He is the 26th District Attorney of the great city of Philadelphia, where I went to college. And he is known as one of the top progressive prosecutors in the country. There's some controversy, as the English would say, about whether he's quote unquote soft on crime. We're going to discuss that in this interview. First of all, Larry, welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Cenk. You know, it's been a long time since we never met. So it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. All right, so Larry, I'm going to run down some of the policies that you had, and then I want to talk about the good, and then discuss whether there was bad and whether crime did go up or not. Right. So you were for ending criminal charges against those caught with marijuana possession. So that one we don't have to discuss. Check. Everybody agrees. There's no rational human being who says marijuana possession, you should go to jail for that. It's like going to jail for a Coors Light. Okay, great. Ending cash bail for those accused of some misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. I'm going to come back to that. Reducing supervision for parolees. Going to come back to that. Seeking more lenient sentences for certain crimes. We'll come back to that. And pursued police misconduct and advocated for greater police accountability. I love that. Okay, so the ones that I'm going to come back to are about crime, and I definitely want to air that out with you. First, on better police accountability. Tell us what you did and then how it was received.
So what we did is applied the law in a way that is even-handed, and what that means is at this point, 7+ years into our administration, we have done things no prior administration did. We have convicted 2 different police officers of homicide while they were on the job and on duty. We have convicted 3 homicide detectives either of perjury or false paperwork in connection with a conviction. There is a homicide detective doing 24.5 to 49 years in state prison for serially raping informants who were working with them, and needless to say, it caused a lot of problems with the cases that he investigated that were homicide cases. So, I mean, those are a few of the cases that we've had. It's not that we're out to get cops or not get cops. It's just that we're out to be even-handed. And that means when you have 6,500 police officers, there are a few of them who are criminals and they need to be prosecuted like anybody else.
So, on this show, we talked a ton about police abuse and how it was so frustrating that nobody ever did anything about it, and they seem to be above the law. So on that count, I love what you're doing because of course they shouldn't be above the law. Of course they should serve and protect, and there needed to be desperate reform, and you had reform. So how did the police union and the police react overall to that?
Well, the first head of the union, who was in there for 19 years, simply put, was a Trumpy guy who was MAGA. And just to give you a sample of who he was, this is a guy who once said, this is 2017, he said that Black Lives Matter protesters were a, quote, pack of rabid animals, unquote. This is a guy who defended a different Philadelphia police officer publicly showing the Nazi tattoos that he had on his body. He was like rolling up his sleeve so that we could all see the joys of his Nazi tattoos. So no, we didn't get along with him at all, and we're not going to, because World War II happened for a reason. When it comes to the new head of the FOP, it's a guy named Roosevelt Poplar. He's been great. This is someone who's serious about protecting his members. He's also serious about law enforcement. He's also the first African-American head of the Fraternal Order of Police in Philadelphia. So it's been a very different situation. One of them's a professional, and the other one is an extreme right-wing knucklehead.
Yeah.
So, I'd rather work with number 2.
Yeah, and I like that, when you thought somebody had to go, you fired him. And, I like Bill de Blasio a lot in New York. I think he gets a really bad reputation for very poor reasons. But the one thing that I thought he should have done was fire more out of control cops, and you did that. So, or at least went after them when they actually committed crimes. So I appreciated that. Okay, that's great. So now let's go back to the crime issues. So, Larry, what people will say is that, well, crime went up in some of these years. You know, you first had your first election in 2017, and now it's obviously 2025. It's been about 8 years, and crime went up in some of the big cities for sure in 2019 to 2023. By the way, it's been coming down since. But let me show one graph of homicides in Philadelphia, and you see there that they spike significantly between 2019 and 2023, but then, or at least in that case, 2021, they start to head down, even though they're very large numbers still. But they've continued to go down since then. It's not just homicides; there's also other crimes that show a similar pattern. So the other side says, at least the other side from you says, yeah, look, you were a little bit too lenient, and that's why crime went up. How do you address that?
We address it with the truth. Here's the truth. Number one, today is the 28th of April, 2025. Homicides in Philadelphia today are the lowest that they have been on this date in 50 years. Okay, those are the facts. Not 5 years, 50 years, and that's good. It's even better when the Philadelphia police put up their public data, and out of the 18 categories of crime and subcategories, we're down in 15 of them. Part of what is disorienting here, and even your graph reflects it because your graph stops in 2023, is that in a 5-year period in the United States, we had the biggest up and the biggest down in violent crime in 5 years. Biggest in recorded history. So it's pretty disorienting, and people don't necessarily catch up with the reality, which is that the pandemic period was one when the entire country was in free fall. We were suffering terribly for a whole lot of reasons. But we are in a different place now. Philadelphia is not just doing well like other big cities. We are 4 consecutive years into doing better than the average of big cities in terms of their improvement. We are not just getting back to the level when I came into office. We are way below the level when I came into office. We are not just the caboose on a train of big cities getting better. We're actually the locomotive, and we were reported widely toward the end of last year as leading all the big cities because we were so far ahead and doing so much better than the national average of big cities. And by the way, what you saw on that graph affected little towns too. It affected the whole country. It's just that, as always in criminology, urban environments are going to show higher concentrations of crime for reasons related to proximity and population, right? So, I mean, the truth is Philadelphia is a triumph in terms of improvement of public safety this year and last year, which was the year when the country, the whole country, had its biggest improvement in public safety in recorded criminological history.
Yeah, so let me back up some of that. As I said in the beginning, I checked 2024 and 2025, and the numbers are significantly down, right? So that's the rest of that graph. We just couldn't find a graph that showed it. But they did rise in that 4-year period, and there's no question about that. I want to come back to talking about a little bit more about why that's the case. But you know, and Philadelphia is you know, in the top 10 cities in crime, but it's also top 10 in poverty. And so those things are closely linked, and it's about the rates. Do they go up? Do they go down? So when we look at some of the things that your critics say might have led to an increase in crime, at least in that 4-year period, they talk about the ones that I said we'll come back to: more lenient sentences for some crimes, so reducing supervision for parolees, and the cash bail situation. Let's start with the cash bail. Now, I was in favor of getting rid of cash bail because I get the argument of, you know, it's, if you apply it to everyone, it doesn't, you know, rich people can get out of jail right away, middle class people can get out of jail 9 out of 10 times right away, but poor people can't, so that's unfair, right? I understand, so it's not about the crime, it's about whether you're rich or not, right? So that's why I was in favor of ending it. But as I look at it, I wonder if there was a side effect there that we didn't expect, and I'm really curious what you think of this. That when you have that, the problem isn't the average person that is charged with a crime. The problem is recidivists. So when you have recidivists who are doing low-level crime and they get there's no cash bail, they just come right back out, do it again, do it again, do it again, and then that's part of what drives up the numbers and creates more crime. So what do you think about that?
Well, I can tell you what these studies actually show. First of all, no cash bail still means some people are held in custody. It just means you're getting money out of the game. They're either held in custody because they present such a danger or they are such recidivists that they should be held in custody. This is what has gone on for 35 years in Washington, D.C. It's now the law in Jersey and Illinois and Kentucky and other places. It's the right way to do things. You just get money out of the game. But it still means in D.C., 12% of all defendants are going to be held until their trial. They should be. If you present a danger to the public and you're rich, you shouldn't get out. And likewise, if you are a broke person who can't pay a minimal bail, you shouldn't be sitting in there just because you're broke on a not so serious offense. We had this policy, which was for 25 different relatively low level offenses. We wouldn't seek cash bail ordinarily. All of these policies are subject to exceptions. You just presented a good exception. It's someone who just keeps committing the crime over and over. That is someone who should probably be held on bail because every time they exit jail, they go out and do it again. But the study showed that there was no increase in crime and there was no increase in people failing to show up for court. So you get more freedom and you don't get more crime, and that's a good thing. And that's where we should be.
So help me understand the recidivist rule. Is there a hard and fast rule on how many crimes they commit before they've got to put up cash for bail, or that they refuse bail altogether, or is it just the discretion of the judge?
Well, we don't set bail. Bail is set by judges. And so the question for us is really, what are we going to recommend? That's my political consultant walking by and waving her tail. And my political consultant, by the way, does better than most long-established political consultants in my Democratic Party. I just want to be clear about that. Okay. But there's no hard and fast rule because individual justice is complicated. If you're dealing with someone who has severe mental health issues and there's a mental health alternative, then maybe you do not need to be in a position where you are actually trying to put that person into custody. Likewise, it depends. When we talk about recidivists, is this the first time, or is this the 25th time? So, look, I was in the game as a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights lawyer for 30 years. We have pretty good judgment about where the exception should be. And I'm the ultimate enemy of mandatory sentencing. I think it's a disaster. It deprives judges of the opportunity to be judges. So we feel the same way about bail. You can have default positions that apply 85, 90, 95% of the time, but they shouldn't be absolute because that's where the injustice comes in, because you just can't predict all contingencies in a situation like that. But bottom line is it was studied independently and by us, and it was a success.
So, all right, one last thing on that though. Do you have a suggestion for your prosecutors as to when to ask that this person not be let out, based on how many times they've committed crimes since being let out?
We have general guidelines, and I am available, as are the supervisors of those units who bring a whole lot of experience to it. So we do have, we have general guidelines, but it's not down to the individual offense. There are at this point, there are about 5,000 different crimes under the laws of Pennsylvania. There's probably 150 that we charge and prosecute all the time. So it does get very specific as to things like health and age and whether or not mental illness is involved and what are the circumstances going on here. Can the prison even deal with this person because they are, for example, type 1 diabetic in the middle of the pandemic, things like that. We have to weigh all of those different factors. So we don't have hard and fast rules, but we do have, we have default positions and they work. Ultimately, when we studied it, it did not cause an increase in crime. People still showed up for court. We were able to stop our jails from becoming super spreaders of COVID, which was an additional and very important factor. And right now, we are enjoying the lowest number of people in county custody that anyone seems to remember. We used to have almost 10,000 people in county custody. We're down to 3,600. And yet we simultaneously have the lowest number of homicides in 50 years. That's called winning.
Yeah, no, that's a fair argument, and I was going to say the city's jail population is down by over half in about a decade. So that's compelling. So when you recommend mental health treatment, how does that work? So do they, because they've committed a crime, are they forced into mental health treatment? And yeah, just tell us about how that's worked for you.
It depends on the situation. First of all, there are some people so mentally ill they cannot stand trial. They will be determined to be unable to stand trial because they can't even understand what a judge is or what their lawyer is. They can't communicate with their lawyer. So that presents challenges. When you have people who do understand the nature of the proceeding, then it becomes more of a question about, can we get at the root cause of the situation? I'm not now talking about Charles Manson. Charles Manson can go to jail, and frankly, not to be mean, but he can die in jail. I'm not concerned about that. I'm speaking more about people who have deep mental health issues, whether it's extremely low intelligence or it's something else that's going on, adult onset schizophrenia, something like that. And for them, we have a unit that specializes in trying to deal with those defendants, trying to get them treatment and support so they're not going to continue to run afoul of the law and be arrested again. But I'm not going to lie to you, mass incarceration eliminated during the period of mass incarceration, those 40 or so years, when we just kept putting more people in jail, we demolished our mental health system. 85% of it disappeared, and it was replaced. Mental health workers were replaced with police officers, not willingly on the part of police officers. They weren't trained for it. They didn't sign up for it. And mental health facilities were replaced with jail cells. So it is a systemic failure. We took something that made us uncomfortable and something that we didn't want to see, such as mentally ill people walking around the street doing things that were either scary or offensive, and we just criminalized it. It's the same thing that's happening with homeless people and unhoused people right now, and it's just a sad commentary on how we don't use public health when we should.
Okay, so now reducing the sentences on some crimes. So one issue with that is if you do that, not only does it reduce the sentences, but it gives you less room to plead down, right? Has that been an issue?
No, I mean, the reality is that we have compared prior administrations to ours, and we are generating only half as many future years of incarceration as prior administrations, and yet we have these remarkably low levels of crime. And no, it's not just this year. Last year, we had the third lowest number of homicides in the last 50 years, despite the proximity to the pandemic. So as for pleading people down, we should not coercively plead people down. People have a sacred constitutional right to a trial if they want it, as long as they're not presenting phony evidence, as long as they're not actually committing additional crimes during the course of their trial with forged documents and perjury, that sort of thing. They should get a sentence after a trial that looks a heck of a lot like what they were offered before. That whole culture of it's 2 years if you plead guilty, but it's 20 if you try it and lose, means that the real crime, the 18 years worth of crime, was your constitutional right to a trial. And we're just not going to be a part of that. What we actually see, though, is we don't have an excessive number of trials. Philly has always had a lot of trials because of the high quality of the jurors who are there, but we don't see a whole lot of trials because the offers we make on the cases are reasonable, and a lot of people are satisfied with that if they are defendants and they know they've committed the crime. And as for the people who get their trial, they should. It's a sacred constitutional right. Unlike the president of the United States, I believe in the Constitution and I uphold it.
Okay, so let's go back to 2019 to 2023. So a big spike in Philly, but also in other big cities. What I've seen in the past, Larry, is that not as much in the rural areas, and it was more in the big cities. So a lot of people thought it was the progressive prosecutors that came in. And I'm also concerned about that. So what's your theory, that it was just COVID in those years?
Well, let me just say this. There is always less crime in a cornfield than there is in the middle of Manhattan. That's
sure,
just
but it's
how
about trends.
If you look at the trends, they were spikier. They were more accentuated in the big cities, which is kind of normal. But there's, criminologists have looked at this. There's absolutely no evidence that it was worse in the locations where you had reformed prosecutors. None. So that whole narrative was false. And more to the point, think back about when we had other big spikes in crime in the United States. No one ever said the hang 'em high conservative prosecutors caused this. If you are a conservative hang 'em high prosecutor, when crime gets high, you say, you see, I was right, reelect me. You need to be tough on crime. They've always gotten a pass on this. The reality is that it's not all about prosecutors causing crime. It's always been much more about prevention, which is lacking and disappeared during the pandemic. And it's also about whether or not you're using modern enforcement. We have a ton of amazing forensics that we are able to use now, and it's been a real emphasis of my administration. They solve crimes and they also keep innocent people out of jail. And that's what we should be doing. But that's not really what's going on with traditional prosecutors' offices, which are a lot more concerned with the politics than they are with actually solving crime and holding people accountable. We do know this. We know that the length of a sentence is not really a deterrent, but what is a deterrent is fear of getting caught. That's about how many of these cases you can solve and whether you can solve them quickly or you're only solving them 30 years later, right? So this is part of the reason why modern enforcement coupled with a deep investment in prevention are so effective in changing the situation. And the real lesson of the pandemic for me, honestly, just think about this for a minute. You had the elimination of sports. You had the elimination of Little League. I'm 64 years old. I have never seen the elimination of organized sports, the elimination of summer camp, the elimination of arts programs for kids, the elimination of places they could go, the inability to go to a classroom where they could interact with other human beings. And you had this massive mess. It wasn't just criminal justice. You had a 500% increase in people seeking treatment for eating disorders. You had high school ideation tending towards suicide at levels we've never seen. At one point, I think it was 1 out of 4 high school kids considered suicide in the last 30 days. You had a reversal of big improvements in public safety in terms of driving. All of a sudden, we found ourselves in a situation where after 30 years of driving getting safer, it got dangerous. And the same thing happened with criminal justice. When you close the courts for almost 2 years, which is what happened in these big cities. Excuse me, my political consultant is at it again. When you close the courts for almost 2 years and you have all these other things going on and you isolate people and then their source of information is Elon Musk. Well, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to have some serious problems, and they played out in criminal justice as well.
Yeah, so when you say detection, you're saying that you think that some of the crime went up because of the masks and it was hard to tell who was who?
It was masks, but it was more than that. You didn't have as many witnesses on the street. In many cities, you had a big decline in the number of available police officers because they were out with COVID. Or in some cases, it was even more cynical than that. There was frankly just an opportunity not to be doing as much. We had a commissioner I got along with very well. And in fact, I've gotten along with all of the commissioners who announced at a certain point in the pandemic, there would be no drug arrests whatsoever. Well, that's not my call. That was her call, and I'm not even here to say it was wrong because there was no vaccine at that point. She was afraid the entire bunch of active police officers on the street was going to shut down because they'd be unable to come to work. These things have effects. Probation offices were closed. You couldn't even get treatment or a urine test to see if you were, back on the stuff. So all of these factors came together. They were kind of a perfect storm, but it wasn't just a storm in criminal justice. It was also a storm in medicine. It was a storm, in education. We saw for the first time every single state go backwards in educational achievement around the pandemic, and it happened to us as well.
Yeah, and you also mentioned prevention. Well, how did prevention go down in that time?
How did it go down? A lot of crime is about young people hurting young people. In fact, especially when you talk about gun violence, that's really what it's about. When kids do not feel like they have a future, when they lose hope, when they're isolated, when there's some level of despair, it becomes so much easier for them to be lured into being a part of a shooting group or part of a gang or part of a drug gang. And they are willing to take risks when they don't see a future that they simply would not take if they saw one. This, in my opinion, is part of why we're doing so much better now. That there really is a world that's much more hopeful for young people, and therefore there are reasons not to pick up the gun.
Yeah, politics and life is a funny thing, because I don't know what would have happened if you were running in 2023 and the chart hadn't gone down yet. And I know certainly some other prosecutors lost in that era. But now, Larry, it seems like you've got a pretty good case with the incarceration being down, but crime also being down over the last 2 years. And at, as you say, at some record levels there in Philadelphia. So it's a really interesting experiment, and there's been some very interesting results from it throughout the different years. And so I'm curious to see how it's going to go. Is it going to keep heading down? Is it going to head back up? That's all of this is fascinating. And on deterrence, I hear what you're saying, that that certainty is more important than the severity of the punishment, but I think severity probably does matter. And so I'm just curious to see how it's going to develop. But now it appears that you have a very good case for re-election, given what's happened over the last couple of years. And so thank you for trying something new. And most importantly, out of all the things that we discussed, the thing we cared most about on the Young Turks was accountability for police, because they were abusing people, and it's not all of them, but there were a lot of folks who had gotten out of hand, and the way to do that is to hold them to account, and you did that in Philadelphia, and I certainly appreciate that. So Larry Krasner, thank you so much for joining us, up for re-election as a district attorney in Philadelphia. Thank you. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.